In this video, we're going to talk about delta tables. We're going to make some modifications to the delta table we created in the last video, and then we're going to go through and check out our transaction log on our data lake. Let's get to it. Hello friends, my name is Austin Liable and I am a trainer for Pragmatic Works, and we do training on Azure. We do training on the Power Platform, many other products, but one of my main goals is to do training on Azure, and one of the features that I love to work with inside of Azure is data lakes. But we've been talking about this storage layer on top of data lakes called the Delta Lake. Well, if we want to refer back to any of those previous videos, definitely go and check those out where we talk about what is Delta Lake. Can we go through and create a delta table? But in this video, we're going to go through and modify the delta table we created in the last one. Remember, delta tables are a type of table format used in Apache Spark that provides several operations for data manipulation and data management. In Python, you can interact with delta tables using a PySpark library, delta.tables. That provides several different operations for working with delta tables, including creating, reading, writing, deleting, updating, and merging. Delta tables will go through and use version history to keep track of all those changes made to the table over time. And then every time a table change is made to a delta table, a new version is stored in the version history. The version history is going to contain all the different records of the changes made to the table, including inserts, updates, deletes, and merges, as well as the metadata associated with each of those different changes. Maybe the user who made the change, the timestamp of when the change was made as well. Delta table maintains the version history in a transaction log, which is stored alongside of the data in our delta table. The transaction log is an append-only log that records all the changes to the table in the order that they were created, and this allows Delta to provide the ACID guarantees to the data lake, ensuring that all the changes to the table are durable, consistent, and isolated. To access the version history of a delta table in Python, you can use a history method of the delta table class in PySpark, and this method returns a data frame containing a record for all the changes made to the table, along with, again, that metadata about the changes, who made the change, and the timestamp. We can then go through and work with the standard data frame operations to query, analyze, and look at the version history of the changes as well to our tables over time using the time travel. All right, enough talking. Let's get to it. Let's go check out our Azure Synapse Analytics workspace where we have created that delta table, and then we're going to go through and run through a notebook where we're going to make some modifications to it. I'll see you over there. All right, so I'm inside of my Azure Synapse Analytics workspace. Remember, in the last module, we went through and we created a delta table using this notebook right here. We went through and we specified the path. We said what we're going to take the data from and everything like that. And then we wrote data in the delta format to our data lake. If I want to go see that delta table inside of my data lake, I can go over to my data hub and go on to my linked Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 container. And then I can go through and open up my primary container where I have that delta table. Remember, this is our employees delta table. If I click inside of this table, I have my delta log, which is going to allow me to see the changes that have been made to that version history over time. Remember, our initial create operation was version 0. So the next change we make to this delta table is going to be version 1, version 2, version 3, so on and so forth. And then we also have these Parquet files that are keeping the records of exactly what the data is on the delta table itself. We're going to come back to this in just a few moments and start working with that and seeing how we've made changes along the way. I already have my Synapse notebook up and running. So I have my Apache Spark cluster, which I need to go through and utilize in order to work with Delta on my data lake inside of a notebook and write PySpark operations. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to, again, establish some variables in this notebook. I'm going to say my Delta table path is going to be to my Delta folder in my employees folder there, the name of my container, and the name of my data lake as well. And then I'm going to create this Delta path utilizing those other three variables, and then I'll go through and print that. So let me go through and run that now. And there we go. We have a slight modification here I might want to make to this. Let's go through and test that out just to make sure everything's working good. Okay, then we had 2 backslashes, but we're good to go now. Again, that's why it's important to go through and maybe print out your path if you're going to be working with this. Now, what we're going to do next is we are going to import a couple of libraries into our Synapse notebook here, into this cluster. So I'm going to import everything from the delta.tables, and I'm going to import as well everything from the PySpark SQL functions. We're going to utilize that just a little bit later. And then we're going to go through and create our delta table path as well. It's going to be called our delta table. It's going to take our delta table, it's going to use a Spark, and it's going to use that path to our data lake and establish that for ourselves. So we're going to go through, import those different operations, as well as specify that path so we can go through and utilize that. And then when we do that, when we bring that data into this notebook, we will be able to go through and see that version history. And so far, we've just had one modification that we've made to this table. We've just gone through and created the table, done a write operation, if you will. So when we go through and check out the history, we're going to see that we have at least one record there, but we're going to make quite a few more modifications as we go along throughout this video. All right, so I've established my delta table. What I want to go through now and do is look at the version history of this table. So I'm going to go through and access my delta table, look at the history. I'm just going to show the 5 records here. We're not going to actually have more than 5 records. We just have the 1 record at this time. But again, this right here is what we're looking at. This version 0, where we initially did a write operation, we went through and we had a number of rows, we had how much data we moved, and things like that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to load the data from the delta table into a data frame. Now, for the purposes of this video, I wanted to call this a delta frame because we have worked with a data frame already to access our CSV, and just to specify the difference, this is going to be going through and doing a read operation from our delta table, and it's going to load from the delta path that we established earlier in this video. Now I'm going to go through and run that. This is going to do a show operation as well, which is going to show me exactly what my delta table looks like at this point in time. You can see that I have the metadata associated with this table, the column names, and then I also have all of the 5 records for the employees who work with Pragmatic Works in my company. Now this is just sample data, just some fun stuff I went through and made up. So we have like IT, speech, sanitation, math departments, salaries that are just made up as well, just to kind of create this faux employee table. Now what I want to do first is I want to go through and show how we can delete from a delta table. Now I can use the different SQL formatted string functions that allow me to delete records. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my delta table and delete from the column salary anyone that has a salary of less than $3,000. If we come through here and see who has a salary of less than $3,000, you will see that I myself in the sanitation department have a salary of only $2,000, so we're going to eliminate my position. So when I go through and run this cell, that's going to delete that from the table, and then we'll go through and verify that it was deleted as well in the next cell. So we'll go through and show our delta frame, if you will, again, and we'll see how we have made a change to that table. All right, so we've gone through and deleted that. Let's go through and look at the delta frame now. So we're going to see that instead of having 5 records like we did in the previous version of the table, if I scroll up here, we have Austin Libel here as record 3. We have now gone through and we have eliminated Austin from this table. So we just have the 4 records now because we deleted that record. Now I can go through again and show off the history of that table. I can go through and see now I have a version 0 as well as a version 1. So this version 1 will be the most up-to-date current version of my delta table. In that version 1, what we were doing as part of the ACID transactions, we were keeping a record of this. We deleted, and then we went through and said, you know, we're going to delete everyone with a salary less than $3,000. We can see the number of files that we removed as well here. There was 1 file that was removed from the delta table with this specific delete operation. Now we're also going to go through and look at another option as well. We're going to show how we can update data. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my Delta table, I'm going to update on the condition that employee ID 1, and we're going to go through and change the department and the salary of employee ID 1. We're going to give Mitchell Pearson a promotion from IT to the head of IT, and we're going to give him a salary bump in accordance with that as well, from $10,000 to $15,000. So we're going to go through, run that again, and update that table. And now we're going to look and see how we've made that change. So we go through and we're going to see that now Mitchell Pearson is the head of IT, and he's now bumped up from $10,000 to $15,000. If we go back up here, we can see that previously he was in just the IT department and that his salary was only $10,000. So again, these changes are happening very quickly and efficiently. Now we're not working with a lot of data, but even so, Spark is going to scale out and allow us to really work with large samples of data very, very efficiently and fast for what our writes are doing. Now we can go through again and see a history of this table one more time. So of course we're going to see version 2 now. You can kind of get the pattern that this is going to go in. We go through and see version 2, the most up-to-date version of the table, the Delta table as it stands right now. In version 2 we did an update. We changed one file for ourselves as well. Now, what we have the ability to do with Delta is, again, go back in time, see the previous versions of our table. So we're going to do the time travel operation here. We're going to go back and see version 0, version 1. What did our table look like in the past? That is something that you might be useful to you, especially when you start doing analytics with Delta tables and things like that. You can do regression analysis, and you can look and see what happened to your table in the past and how it looks in the future or in the present, if you will. And then we can also go through and potentially run back a previous version of our Delta table if we have some sort of error. We can revive it, if you will, so that we have the ability to remove any errors that we incurred in a previous write that was not correct. So let's go through and see that version history now. All right, so I'm going to go through and show off the time travel operation. So what this is going to do is it's going to take my Delta frame, it's going to read in the Delta format and look at the version as of. This version as of is going to be extremely important when you're working with time travel. And then to specify the version as of, version 0, version 1, so on and so forth. So I'll go through and run this. This is going to show my Delta frame after I have loaded the version as of 0. So that was the initial write of the table. You can see Austin Liebel is still in this version because he has not yet been removed. And we go through here and see version 1 as well. And we can see that Austin Liebel has now been removed. So again, time travel, a very, very powerful feature of the Delta table and Delta Lake. Now let's go through and do one more thing. What we want to simulate here is a merge. Merging with Delta is very easy and works well. So all we're going to have to do is kind of use some SQL logic to go through and say when we want to merge and how we want to merge specifically. When records are matched, what do we want to do? When records don't match, what do we want to do? So this is going to go through and it's going to update our table as well as bring in some new records as well. So something of an upsert, if you will. So we're going to go through, add in 2 new employees to this Delta table, and also make a modification to one of the records that already exists. So let's get to that as well. All right, so to start with, we need to bring that data into our notebook. So we have this other employee list that's in my data lake. So I'm going to go through and bring in data frame 2 is what I'm going to call this. It could be called data frame 1 because there is not a data frame in this one, but just to specify that this is not the original data frame from the previous video, I want to go through and just call this data frame 2. Now we can go through and see that Austin Liebel has still been removed. We've added in a couple new records. 6 and 7 for Angelica and Jonathan. But we also had an issue. Mitchell Pearson didn't work out as head of IT, I guess. So he's been demoted to IT, but we did kind of keep his salary up from that $10,000. But we said, hey, if you're not the head of IT, we're not going to give you $15,000. So we're going to revert that back. We'll go through, and now what we're going to do in this cell right here is we're going to take our delta table and alias that as old. And then we're going to take our data frame 2 and alias that as new, based on the condition that the old employee ID is equal to the new employee ID, that those records are how we're going to determine our merge. And then we're going to have some SQL operations here where we say when matched, update, and then when not matched, insert. So we go through and we can say all those different records for ourselves. So let's go ahead and execute this now. And then once we have gone through and merged that, we'll look at our delta table one more time. And then we'll go over to the data lake and see how many changes we've made and see the version history and see our delta log and all of that great stuff. All right, so my delta merge was executed successfully. I'm going to go through and see one final time the current status of my delta frame. And there we go. Again, those records have been inserted into this delta table. We have 2 new records there. Mitchell Pearson, again, we have gone through and demoted him to the IT department. And then we decreased his salary in accordance with that. And then we'll go through also and just see one last time here the version history of our table. So we've made ultimately 4 different initial operations. They've all been different ones: write, delete, update, merge, that we've been able to work with, and we can go through and see how those different operations work, and we can of course do the time travel as well. Now let's go back over to our data lake. I already have the tab up here right now. So remember, this is our employees table in our data lake, but this is a delta table specifically. Now when I go through and look at this table here, I'm going to have multiple Snappy Parquet files here that are going through maintaining that delta log for me. The delta log allows me to go through and say, hey, you know, which of these versions is the most up to date? What happens if I want to go back and look at the previous versions of this as well? So we can go through and see the time that we modified this. It is time stamped, as well as I can go through here to my delta log and see those JSON files that are basically telling the delta table exactly how to go through and how to make sure you know you are looking at the most up-to-date version. What was added? Which of these Snappy Parquet files is the most up-to-date? Which are still dependent upon retaining state of the delta table. Now what we have the ability to do ultimately is, as we create more and more operations, we ultimately get a checkpoint Parquet file that will go through and it will tell us, hey, this is a checkpoint, we're going through, and at this point potentially we can remove some of those previous logs as well as Parquet files that are composed of our delta table. We can potentially do that with a vacuum operation. But over time, this would be really more to manage and would become a burden on our storage cost if we were not removing some of the files that are not referenced or utilized anymore. So you have the ability to go through and specify how long you want to retain different logs and tables. By default, your Snappy Parquet files are going to be retained for 7 days, and your log, like these JSON logs here, are going to be retained for 30 days. But you can manually update that for yourself. Hopefully you've enjoyed this one. This has been a deep dive, hopefully, or at least a better dive into delta tables and how to use them, how they're working, and then how to go through and make modifications to that and see that the data lake can go through and look at the most recent version. Now again, what I do have the ability to do is go through and run a SQL query against this delta table. I can go through and specify the format. Now if I just went and said, hey, I know these are Parquet files in here, I might run into an error actually. So let's see what happens if I say that this is a Parquet format. Let me just run this really quickly and see why this does not work, why we need to say that this is the delta format of this table. So this looks great. We have some data here, but we see we also have a lot of duplicates here, right? You can go through and read with serverless SQL on demand inside of Synapse. You have the ability to read multiple Parquet files inside of one folder. But if you're looking at a delta folder, you're going to get bad results. So you need to know when you have a delta and when you don't. So what we would do instead is go through and specify that we want to query with the delta format. You can see that delta is utilized there. And at that point, we're only going to be looking at the most recent version of this table. Now, ultimately, you cannot go back and look at the version as of inside of your delta table with serverless SQL on demand. You do need Spark capabilities to be able to work with that. That would be awesome, but that's something that's managed completely by Spark. So when we go through and use serverless SQL, we only can really see that current version of that. If you want that version history and the time travel, you would need to, again, spin up one of those Spark clusters for yourself inside of some sort of web interface to write Python or Scala or SQL, and then return those results for yourself. Hopefully you've enjoyed this one. We're going to dive more into Delta in the next one and see maybe, hey, I don't really know how to write Python. I don't know how to write Scala, but I do know how to fill out a graphical user interface. So what we're going to work with are data flows to be able to work with our Delta tables inside of Synapse. I'll see you in the next one.